Okay, I'm going to minimize the tile. Okay, so good morning once again to everyone and welcome back. Here we are on the course on fundamental principles in Catholic bioethics within the Master of Science in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Always beginning with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Lord, send forth your Spirit, and we shall be recreated. You shall renew the face of the earth. Especially, Lord, we pray for crisis areas of the world right now, very much for the Ukraine and other conflict areas of the world. May we be agents of peace in our immediate surroundings and through our prayer for the whole world, especially during this very, very special time of Lent as we prepare to commemorate not only your resurrection, Lord, historically, but also the promise of resurrection for each one of us. In the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So as always, any questions or comments from previous lectures or anything? All right, so I've been sending out emails. You all got it because you connected this morning. And also I'm going to the official website. I'm going to the official emails for all of us. Just leave it slant, leave it a little open for when Jose arrives. Supposedly Jose and Antonio are also supposed to come. You can put the little stopper at the bottom of there's a little stopper at the bottom of the door, sorry, for the in-person. Yeah. There you go, thank you. Thank you very much. Right, so going forward, we're gonna use our STU email, all right? From now to the end of the program, simply because all of our communication, at least in the program, is STU communication, all right? So it's kind of a virtual paper trail, if you will. Of course, if there's anything personal or outside of the program that you wanna consult or talk about, we can always use our personal emails for that. Okay, I think everyone has access. And speaking of that, there's also Canvas. I think I showed last time Canvas. Did I talk about Canvas last time? What you do is you can go to, for example, the website of St. Thomas University, and then these tabs, this one, My Bobcat, right? And then you see Canvas here. It's a portal. You have to sign in. And you get all these tiles, we call them tiles. These are all the courses that I'm teaching the semester and so forth. But our tile, for example, this one, okay? Now 4 of you are in this one and 3 of you are in the other one. But the tile that you get is your own tile. So you don't get each other's tiles for these courses. So for example, on this one, it is Father Franco, Antonio, Father Daniel, and Farid, Dr. Farid, okay? And then you can go, I'm not gonna click on this, but you can go to grades and you can see your individual grades there. I have to update the last 2 summaries, which I'll do that hopefully this afternoon. But going forward, you can see your grade there. And I also return your paper. What I should do is, as I grade it, I should put the grade in here so you can see it. And then I return the corrected paper back to you. All right, so 4 of you are there. That's because of the technical issue that I didn't have a chance to register all of the students in the full semester. So I had to create a second course in the second semester, or the second half of the semester. We have these mini terms that are technically 8 weeks. Don't worry about it, it's a technicality, but the other 3, I was able to rescue you in here. All right, so Christina, Dr. Jose and Father Stephen, you're in this Minimester SP2. Don't worry about that. You're all right, like we said in the 60s, in the 70s, peachy keen and hunky-dory. All right, so anyway, you can go to Canvas, look at the tile, and what I have there mostly is the syllabus that is posted that I also emailed to you, but then your individual grades here that you can see also as you progress. Yeah, see? Oh yes, okay. That one, good question, because you can go then to the other tile, the 514, and where's 514? Here's 514. Dr. Jose, good morning, welcome. Leave it ajar, please, for maybe Antonio shows up. Thank you. Just a little slant, yeah, little slant. Thank you. It's a little awkward, but can be done. Thank you. All right, so this is a tile for Bio 514, right? There's a home page, right? And then what you do is go to syllabus down here. And then open the syllabus. And there's a link in it. So the syllabus always has a lot of blah, blah, blah. But there it is. On being a scientist. I don't know if it's going to be active. But that's it there. Okay. You can also just punch in to Google on being a scientist. National Academy of Sciences, right? And that's the one. You can download it for free. Sorry? Canvas. But also, like I say, you can just take the title on being a scientist and punch it into Google and you get the site. All right. So summary of each chapter is about 20 chapters, but each chapter is about 2 pages. So, all right. Okay, there's also the 3 modules that I haven't talked about yet. We'll talk about the modules, but Dami actually is going to extend beyond the deadline of the course itself. So you have time to do the modules. Don't worry, I'm sure everybody's passing, because if you don't pass the module, you'll do it again until you pass it. So I can still give you a grade for this and have those modules pending to do online. Virtually the 3 modules. All right, any other question there? No? Okay, let's get into something exciting here, because up until now, I have tried to prep you for this lecture, which is the biological side of human evolution. And then the next lectures are going to be on the theological side of human creation as a species, as a whole. And then the final lecture will be integrating the 2, okay? So the first thing I wanna say is that I'm not using the chapter from Meyer on human evolution. I found another book that is more up to date, and it's actually a little simpler, and it's Barton and Associates. It's on the outline that I sent you, and here also. And then after today's lecture, I'll actually send you a little summary of this chapter. I think it's chapter 24, 25 of Barton and Associates, and the title is just Evolution. Anyway, I'll give you that reference, but I'm using that reference for today's lecture. And these are the things that we're going to look at still. We are here still at the organic level, right? At the biological organic level as being materially alive, which we can translate that into one word, which is metabolism. All right, metabolism, which is body functioning. And we share that with every other species that is living or has lived here on Earth so far. If we have a species that is living, an individual that is living, whether it's an animal, a plant, a bacterium, or an archaea or fungus, all right, they are metabolizing. And it's at 2 levels. at the level of the entire organism. For example, let's continue to consider humans. We have digestion is a type of metabolism, circulation and respiration, breathing, and so that's organismal metabolism at the level of the whole body. And typically that is the purview of medicine, right? And so something can go wrong in the metabolism and then the doctor intervenes on that, the medical doctor. But when we take metabolism, that is kind of a summary or a complex interaction of systems that are made up of organs, that are made up of tissues, that are made up of cells. And so really at the basis of metabolism is cellular metabolism. Every single cell in our body metabolizing, in other words, having biochemical reactions in a very orderly way. Typically, we call them cascades or something like that, but there are these chemical reactions that are occurring in a very, very orderly fashion, sometimes lightning fast and sometimes slowly, but that's at the cellular level. So when we put all these trillions of cells together, we get tissues, from tissues we get organs, and from organs we get organ systems. Okay, welcome Antonio, find a spot anywhere. All right, so that's what I mean by being organically alive, being materially alive, because metabolism, we can measure. We can measure. Remember, in science, empirical science, we're obsessed about numbers. So we want to measure it. We want quantity in addition to quality, right? And so we can measure metabolism, rates of reactions, as simple as that. And then we can put it all together. And there are actually maps of metabolic pathways, thousands of metabolic pathways that occur in each cell to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the specialized tissue that we're looking at. And putting that whole map together is really the organismal metabolism, was what keeping whatever organism alive. Again, whether it's an animal, a plant, a fungus, or a bacterium, or an archaea. They want their own classification aside from the bacteria simply because they are deprived of a membrane in their cell walls. So this is human evolution, metabolically speaking, organically speaking, all right? And so basically for the past 8 lectures, for the past 7 lectures, including this one, I've been bracketing the whole metaphysical reality of a human soul. And when did that happen? For the first time. God willing, the next 2 or 3 lectures that we have left. All right, so lines of evidence for human evolution as a species, as a whole. So here we are in phylogenetics, right? Not ontogenetics, but the origin of the entire species, phylogenetics, or the entire group. So we'll look at phylogeny precisely, the binomial classification of Homo sapiens. We'll look at the fossil record, human fossil record, in other words, the bones that have been left behind by a few humans that were not radically decomposed and destroyed. Specifically, the size of the skull. So the most interesting fossil to find is a skull, right? Of whatever species, of animal, of course, because these are the only ones that have skull. Because then that can tell us something, at least about the brain size and brain volume. Doesn't tell us about the convolutions of the brain, but at least overall brain volume, which is informative. Then from there, we're going to do an association between skull size and cultural development. So here, you see, we're going to make a speculative jump between the brain and the mind, from the brain to the mind, because the skull houses the brain, but culture is a product of the mind. Bipedalism, which happened in the Homo species already, and even before Homo. Then tools and making tools that make tools, get there. The whole thing about fire, harnessing fire, again, the only species that has harnessed fire, which catapulted us forward culturally tremendously. And finally, culture, including religion, which can be seen as a manifestation, one particular very special manifestation of culture. Okay, so phylogeny. We are classified as Homo sapiens, organically, as a material species that lives on Earth. And when we follow the phylogeny of Homo sapiens, we see that the genus is Homo. The family is hominid, but there are other hominids that are not Homo, right? So there are several species in a genus, there are several genera in a family, there are several families in an order, and so on and so forth. Each one of these categories goes from the least inclusive or the most exclusive, which is done at the species level, to the most inclusive or least exclusive at the level of domain. Follow? Okay, so let me just finish the thought. There are several genera in any family, 2 or more genera, right? So the level of family, we belong in the hominid family. But there's a break in between. So I told you there are subcategories. The most common subcategories are sub and supra. For example, subfamily, suprafamily, all right? But then when it's more in between, so there would be a subgenus and supragenus. Supragenus would be up here. Not every one of these main categories has sub or supra, but some do. One in particular, for example, is this one, phylum chordate. Phylum chordate is that we have a chord, specifically a notochord, which may or may not be segmented, the notochord or the chord, the vertebral cord. When it is segmented, then we have a vertebral cord. In other words, we have vertebrae, the cord, the rigid, semi-rigid, semi-flexible cord is segmented, and the segments are vertebrae. And they are segmented, and therefore they articulate. And that's the best of both worlds, because we get rigidity by the cord, otherwise known as a spinal column. But we also get flexibility, some flexibility by the vertebrae, which are articulated between each other. You see, so the best of both worlds. We get some rigidity by the cord, by the spinal cord, but at the same time, we get some flexibility by the articulation of the vertebrae. And so that belongs to a subphylum, the vertebrates. And we're very familiar with the vertebrates, the 5 vertebrates, right? Fish, amphibian, reptile, birds, and mammals. And those are vertebrates, but that technically is a subphylum of the chordates. So that's a very famous subphylum. In fact, I think that's the only one I actually know by heart. Okay, but all of these categories, we could come up with sub and supra, except of course the domain, there's no supra domain, right? But there are infra species, or at that point we start getting a little fuzzy because there could be varieties. Infraspecies technically would be a variety, okay? And some species have a lot of variety, other species have practically no variety. Example, well, we can say probably the human species for us, we have a lot of variety. Look at all the different faces in the world, right? Each face practically is unique. So that's a variety, that's a variation. And we select on faces, right? For example, the woman selects on the man's face and vice versa. So it has value, it has biological value, reproductive value, but we're all the same species. Other species, many other species don't have anywhere near the variety, at least that we can tell, of faces. Their faces are pretty much, they look the same, at least to us. Anyway, I'm digressing. There was a question, please, Jose. All right. You're going to describe tribe. So yep. Have to wait after you describe it before I ask, but right now. Yeah. So tribe is an in-between category between family and genus, right? And it's informative because here we have hominin tribe, all right? And that's why I put it in bold, because we are of the tribe of the hominin. There's also clan. And when we talk about tribe and clan, we also jump. So this is also informative. This category of tribe and clan are very useful to us because they bridge an otherwise gap between biology and anthropology, specifically cultural anthropology. The cultural anthropology looks at what? Studies what? Culture. Yeah, the origin of culture and the development of culture, right? Material culture, but also, let's say, intellectual and spiritual culture, as for example, a language. Where does a language reside materially? You know, there are language centers on the surface of the cerebral cortex. But so tribe and clan is very much the daily fare of anthropology or cultural anthropology. And they talk about human tribes and human clans, right? Then race is very much a cultural category, but it has no biological meaning, race. When we talk about race, ethnicity is a little more informative. But in these government forms, when they ask you the race, you might as well put Martian because it doesn't have it's a political category, basically, all right, for the purpose of funding or whatever, appropriations. But tribe and clan are informative, and they kind of bridge that gap between biology, strict biology, you know, hardcore material metabolism, and cultural anthropology. Okay, so we are from the tribe of hominin, which means there are other genera in the tribe of hominin that are not Homo, but we haven't discovered them. So far as I know, the only genus in the tribe of hominin is the genus Homo. Yep, please.
So would, let's say, the current use of the word tribe, which I think logically in the United States, I would think of the American Indian tribes.
Right.
Are those tribes from our perspective, or are they, or is that the
right? Okay. The fast answer is I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how much correlation there is or how much overlap there is between the cultural tribe of Native Americans, for example. I think that a more specific word that anthropologists would use would be nation, right? They talk about, for example, they talk about the Iroquois nation, right? And they talk about the Inuit nation. There are a number of nations, of Canadian nations, that are in the Vatican right now, trying to reconcile the whole thing that happened there about 100 years ago with the adoptions, not adoptions, but the orphanages, and trying to integrate the native nations from what is today Canada into European culture, Canadian/European culture. You know, what's been in the news about those orphanages and mass graves that were found in those orphanages, and the fact that maybe, according to secular news, about 60 or 70% of those orphanages were run by the Catholic Church. There's a mentality maybe about a century ago to try to integrate into the culture, into the new culture, the modern culture of European/Canadian, those native populations, right? I guess something analogous to in the US territory could be the reservations and all of the social cultural issues that are going on there to this day. All right, but anyway, here we have tribe. See, please.
I'm sorry, Father. And maybe you're about to explain this, but did you say that there is only the genus Homo in the tribe hominin?
As far as I know, yes. Okay, but frankly, I confess I'm not an expert there. There may be more. This gets into the whole field of taxonomy, and there are taxonomists who they can get a PhD in taxonomy or phylogenetics. But as far as I know, we are at least the only existing.
Okay, I assume, I'm wondering what the usefulness of the tribe classification is at that point.
Yeah, basically, right, because there could be some bones, in other words, to try to fit in the fossil record into a fuller classification. We need that tribe category because we're going to look at other homos that are not sapiens from the fossil record. All right.
Okay.
They will still all.
I trust you.
Yeah, there's something there. There's something there that the tribe hominin is a legitimate category that is used mostly in anthropology and cultural anthropology. But it is an in-between. It is a truly in-between. It's not a supragenus and it's not an infrafamily.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so it's there for now. Then of course we go up to family, but in the family hominid, we'll share several other genera that are not Homo. Going further up, more inclusive, right? The primates, which are basically the monkeys. That's at the level of order, and that order fits into the class of mammals. Imagine now, mammal is getting pretty large because there are many other, I think there are about 3 dozen around 3 dozen orders of mammals. We can think of the carnivores, for example. We can think of the herbivores. We can think of the ungulates. The ungulates are the ones that walk on their uña. The uña is the nail, toenail. Basically, we're talking about horses and zebras and their derivatives, right? Bump it up to a larger inclusion, the chordates and the vertebrates as a subphylum there. Then, of course, getting bigger, Animalia, you can imagine what that covers. And finally, Eukarya, those who have a true nucleus is very, very inclusive, right? 3 domains, Eukarya, Prokarya, and the Archaea. All right, so here it is, phylogenetics. And we're really gonna drill from here on down. To represent this, because an image says a thousand words, here is at the level of species. At the level of genus, we share the genus with other homos that are not sapiens, like Homo neanderthalis, for example, otherwise known as Neanderthal man or woman, all right, Homo neanderthalis. By the way, all the other homos, and they're anywhere between half a dozen to a dozen, depending on how they're classified, does get a little fuzzy. They're between half a dozen to a dozen homos that are fossils from the fossil record, and they're all extinct except sapiens. So we are the only species of the genus that is still living. At the level of family, the hominids we share with other monkeys, basically bipedal that walk upright. When we go to order, it becomes even larger. That's where we pick up our nearest cousin, which is the chimp, the break around 6 million years ago, more or less, the node. Then we get to the level of class. Of course, we share that with non-primates. For example, the ungulates, zebra, and the, what are the marine mammals called? I forget the class name, it'll come to me. The level of phylum, of course, we have to include non-mammals, like amphibians, reptiles, birds, and fish. And at kingdom, we have to include non-vertebrates, like sponges, insects, and starfish, coelenterates, and echinoderms. And finally, at the level of domain, all those who have a true nucleus, including plants, for example, and fungi. And some protozoans, microscopic, remember the grab bag of protists, right? Which are basically single cell or colonial animals or organisms. So you see, it gets more and more expensive, right? Okay, so it's just a little review of the phylogenetics, please.
The difference between hominid and primate is in the bipedal component.
That's one of them, but there are others. More detail, I'm drilling in, okay? So I'm drilling in. Here are numbers. So the level of species, there's only one living Homo, which is Homo sapiens, at the level of genus also. At the level of family, that's what I mentioned, between half a dozen to a dozen. The rest are all from the fossil record. At the level of order, there are about 3 dozen orders, just under 3 dozen orders there of the primates. Class, about half a dozen classes, etc. Let's get into more interesting, going into the primates, okay? So the primates is the level of order, all right? This is the middle ground. By the way, this is the one that, at least in my mind, students have more difficulty with. Why? Because that's what I had difficulty with when I was a student. When I was learning this for the first time in high school biology, the phylogeny, or scientific classification. Generally, people remember family, genus, species, because it's similar to us. You know, we have siblings, have individual names, but they have a common last name. So that's at the level of species and genus. And then we belong to families that are, for example, we have first cousins, second cousins, and third cousins, all in the more extended family, right? So we can look at a nuclear family, or we can go up to the extended family, 3 generations or more. That's in the small, the kind of the exclusive range. In the inclusive range, domain is a big word. Domain is very inclusive, most inclusive. Then kingdom is pretty large, right? When we talk about kingdoms, it's a pretty large area. And then phylum starts getting technical. But in between class and order, that's where sometimes which one comes first or which one is more inclusive than the other. And a little mnemonic that I use is, if I don't have order in class, I can't teach anything. And this goes back to when I was teaching high school. When I started teaching high school, I was Mr. Chaffee before the seminary. And I was just fresh out of college. I was in my early 20s with a bachelor's in biology. And of course, I was going to change the world and beyond, right? So I started teaching high school, assuming that the kids actually wanted to learn something. And the first day of class, I was hit with the hard reality that they were very far away from being there mentally, even though their bodies were all there. However, and this is even before high-tech cell phones. So they were just having a field day talking to one another while I'm trying to teach something. And I say, hello, and they say, oh, goodbye. So I said, well, I got to put some order in this class, otherwise I'm not teaching anything. So order is in class. There's order or disorder within the class, all right? A little mnemonic. Okay, so we are at the level of the order of primates here. Look at this. It's pretty inclusive. The primates goes all the way from us to the lemurs. And also includes rare primates like the lorises and potos and the bush babies and the tarsiers. And look at how wide-eyed they are. That's because they're nocturnal. Okay, so they're wide-eyed and they look astonished as they are photographed, and they're endangered, and they're mostly in Madagascar or in Asia, typically tropical Asia, all right, Southeast Asia. But they're also from the same node that goes back about between 80 and 90 million years ago. So this is actually before, this node is before the extinction of the dinos, which was around here between 70 and 60 million years ago, okay? We assume that the dinos back 3 million years before, 30 million years before their extinction, were maybe a little less, a little smaller and a little less voracious and aggressive. So there were few mammals. My point about this is that the mammals were already present by the time of the dinosaurs, but they were not these guys, because these guys are all contemporaries, right? So there are no contemporary ancestors. That's it's a little philosophical, but it has existential value. We did not derive from the chimpanzee, and the chimpanzee did not derive from us because we're contemporaries. And we cannot have ancestral contemporaries or contemporary ancestors, right? Our great-great-great-grandparents are our ancestors, but they're dead. So we cannot have contemporary ancestors, evolutionarily speaking. So no, we did not derive from the monkey, and the monkey did not derive from us. Rather, what we have is a common ancestor that goes back about 90 million years ago, a node. All right, so that branch broke off, as you can see, approximately, and this is from the fossil record, which again is very scant, right? We talk about the paucity or the scarcity of the fossil records. I'll drill more into that a little bit later. But even so, we can make a sketch of what was going back. The big break here was about 60 million years ago. Precisely, this coincides, if you bring it down, to the extinction, the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. I'm harping on the dinosaurs because they were by far the most voracious things around. Okay. And so look at this. This can be considered an expansive radiation. So while the dinosaurs were around, these ancestor primates were barely surviving as little tiny guys and gals hitting underneath big rocks. Or way, way up in the tree branch somewhere where they couldn't be found because they were the size of half a hot dog, or those little mini dogs, mini wieners that come in the can, right? That's the only thing that could survive the voracity of the dinos. But then when the dinos disappeared, guess what? There was the habitat became available, niche availability. So of course, nature being tenacious and nature being opportunistic, nature is going to inhabit that niche. All right, so we can see here a little bit of an expansive radiation of the primates, which then continued to subdivide, but in a more reasonable fashion, because the selective pressure was different. This selective pressure here between this node, the single development, and this expansive radiation, this development was drastic, was a catastrophic event of speculated to be a meteorite that wiped out the dinos after all the dominoes fell in place. But these further radiations, right, are more discrete and more long-lived, because it's taken now 60 million years to get to these radiants, whereas it only took 30 million years to do this, actually in a short time, to have this expansion, all right? So see, this is also indirect evidence of that catastrophic event that happened and the wiping of the dinos and all that. I say this because also some fundamentalists, including doctors, are promoting this fantasy that dinos were actually coexisted with humans, and they are even in the Bible. They capture Leviathan as an example, which is a huge animal described in the Old Testament, right? And possibly even the whale that swallowed Jonah, so forth, because they claim that there is soft tissue that has been found of these dinos. And it's not real soft tissue, has been a substitution of what used to be soft tissue inside bones that became elastic and so forth. That's a whole different chapter. But that's, again, what we call pseudoscience. It's, and in theology, we call it biblical theological eisegesis, right? Projecting something into scripture that is not there. Like, for example, one time there was, someone was doing a filming of a of the Roman Empire, somewhere, some Roman legion conquering a place in Europe somewhere. And one of the soldiers pulled out a cigarette and started smoking. Rather anachronistic. May have even used a lighter. All right, so the radiants, you can see we have two main groups, right? These guys, and then these guys over here. But we go further into the radiation. The radiation that I'm mostly interested in is this one, which is known as the old world monkeys and the new world monkeys. Old world known as, basically, this is when Pangaea and Gondwana land were fracturing. Remember the past 500 million years where they were fragmenting, and the continents were drifting away from each other. Some of these primates stayed in what is known as the old world, meaning Africa, Asia, Eurasia, and whereas North and South America had already separated and not united yet in the Isthmus of Panama. So North and South America are still to this day two tectonic plates that more recently were united into Central America, what we know Central America today. And that's that's the new world monkeys, which generally are smaller and more tree climbing. Some of the old world monkeys ventured into the savanna. And the apes, what is known as the great apes, we are included in there. All right, so really we are closer to the old world monkeys, like for example, the mandrill, and then we are to the new world monkeys, because our node with the old world monkeys is about 25 million years ago, whereas with the new world monkeys, our node is about 40 million years ago. Okay. Yes. Yep. Origin, several hundred million years. Okay, but when we talk about origin, we're talking about some small reptile, kind of a lizard-like thing, and then they grew, yeah, and then they got into, it's kind of a runaway selection. What happens with the dinosaurs? The voracity. So you have to have at least one of each. You know, you have to have a herbivore dinosaur that feeds on plants directly, on producers. So that's the primary consumer. Then at some point you have a carnivore dinosaur that feeds on the herbivore. And then you start getting that. But when the carnivores get more and more voracious, right, they start getting larger between them because of the voracity and muscle mass, just biomass and teeth and structure for hunting. But the herbivores also have to get larger. The selective pressure is that the larger herbivore is going to survive, to the point where you get those huge, what are those called? Since we're in the dinos for a moment, just fun. Even to this day, there's still a controversy whether they're really reptiles or not, because some may have had some hair, which would have made them mammals. But I don't know if mammary glands have actually been found. So I want to talk about, where's maybe some images. We'll do just diagrams. Yeah, these guys, definitely. These guys were the brontosaurus, right? These were herbivores, because there's no way that this thing could hunt by the biomass. But this is a response to the carnivores, who is looking here in the back. The guy who's very agile, the Tyrannosaurus. Okay, he's so agile that the forward legs, the four limbs, F-O-R-E limbs, have become degenerate, almost vestigial, just for grabbing and stuffing it into the mouth. But the hind legs have become disproportionately large for running very fast. And then the mouth is it's basically an eating machine. The marine equivalent of this guy is basically the sharks. It's just a long tube eating machine. They even eat rocks, sharks. Yeah, and they eat these boulders so that the boulders then crunch around in the stomach and allows them to digest and break down the shell of a sea turtle and things like that. So it's just amazing. It's a fantastic eating machine, and sharks are basically, survived a very primitive design. It's kind of an ideal design for the top carnivore. So is this guy. But of course, you can see the more voracious they got, the bigger the herbivores got. And the tail was basically a defense, because the tail not only balanced the neck, right? And they definitely needed the forelegs. They needed to be on all fours and all the support they can get, the four thick columns. The tail was long to counterbalance the neck, but also that tail, as it got thinner toward the end, can be swiveled around and whip. So basically a tail whip could fragment this guy into pieces. So that was their defense. So they were not as easily caught as they're not as awkward. They are awkward. They basically just had to sit there and waggle their tail at their enemies and whip them to death. So anyway, you can see the runaway stuff happening, right? Right. So back to more calmer, milder waters of our own human evolution. Yes, so let's drill into the family. So we got class, order, family, right? So let's get into the hominids. These are the great apes, and basically include 4 groups: orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and humans today. So I'm looking at contemporaries, all right? I'm looking at contemporaries. The great apes are these 4: orangutan, gorilla, chimp, and human. Now, and percentage homology. Here we go. This at the chromosomal level. This at the genome level. Percentage homology. Okay, with the chimp to human, 99%. With the gorilla, 98%. And to the orangutan, 97%. And what's interesting here is also, as I'm talking, is that whereas the orangutan is definitely arboreal, meaning living up in the trees, and their hands and feet are very apprehensive, they can grasp, right? Look at the opposing thumb, very distinct on the feet and on the hands. Our toes are not opposing the other toes, right? The big toe is not opposing the other toe. So our foot is not apprehensive at all, cannot grasp. Well, we can grasp a few things between the toes a little bit, but very, very little. We're definitely bipedal. So from arboreal, living essentially their lifetime up in trees, the orangutan, to the plain, the ground, level ground, gorilla and chimp, and human. So we can see a gradual, even with contemporaries, we can see the gradual migration to level ground. And that's because of an environmental change, a climatic change that occurred several million years ago. Okay, so percentage homology, and I always like to point out, the French say la petite différence, right? La petite différence is 1% or 2 or 3%. That makes us human with everything that that implies, including spirituality and the possibility, the reality of eternal life, actually. It's not a possibility, it's a reality of eternal life in 1 or 2 modes, right? Either salvation or damnation. Now, let's drill a little further, looking at our closest neighbor, which is the chimp, the 99% homology. The split happened anywhere between 5 and 8 million years ago. So that's in the broad range, between 5 and 8 million years ago. In the narrow range, between 6 and 7, so about 6.5 million years. If you want to zero in on the mean, but it's a pretty broad range simply because, again, the paucity of the fossil record. We have very few individuals, maybe just dozens of these crania around. both crania of the homini and the gorillini. Okay, so this may be a tribal difference here. This may be at the level of tribe. Okay, so that may answer an earlier question. Hominini and gorillini, two different tribes. Now, so we're going to continue on this line of the hominini, all right, or the hominins. So really, when we're talking about tribe, this is the scientific, this is the Latin name. I talk about hominin, but in Latin is hominini. So this is a tribe. So there we go. Two tribes of one family, which is the hominids. All right. Moving forward, we're going to explore these crania in a little more detail. Yes, correct. So the family is hominid. Family is hominid, right? But now the hominid family is subdivided into tribes, right? Before we get to genus. And here is the two tribes. The hominini tribe and the gorillini tribe. And the name is very informative, right? So who got left out of the hominini? The gorillas. I don't know if there is an orangutanini tribe. But it distracts us because we want to stay in the hominini tribe within here. Because we're trying to get at the level of genus, okay? We're trying to get at the level of genus. And the big question is, did the other homos also have a soul? Ultimately, because we know we have a soul. Yes.
From the set, so the orangutans, current ones,
yeah.
In the gorilla.
I don't know. Well, I don't know. I don't know. I think not because I don't see it here. Right, so it's not. Okay, so by exclusion, right, by omission. Good, thank you for the question. So gorillini include the gorilla and the chimpanzee. The bonobo is also a controversial classification, all right? Bonobo could be a little ideological and political because the bonobo looks exactly like a chimpanzee, but it's not as aggressive as the chimpanzee. So what do we have? This is interesting because you know, we use the biological definition. I'm using the biological definition of species from Meyer. That definition is about 100 years old. And ever since then, there have been other definitions of species that are not strictly biological. They're more ecological or they're more cultural or anthropological, especially when we get into the hominini and the hominids, right? This is what I'm saying. The bonobo, the word bonobo comes from bono, which is good, Father Daniel. And bonobo chimpanzee, right? Now they may even slant it here. What happens? So this is a bonobo. It's a chimpanzee who is nice as opposed to mean. So the chimpanzees are very aggressive, especially the male. The alpha male is always beating on the females, on the harem. In fact, I'll tell you 10:30. I'm going to hold that story until when? When can we talk about, no, I think it's a good time to talk about this. So the bonobo and the chimpanzee are very closely related. I don't know percentage homology, actually, it's what I should look up. It's percentage homology on the DNA of the bonobo and the chimpanzee. But the chimpanzee straight up is very aggressive, its behavior, especially the male, right? And it's a cultural thing. That's how they maintain their tribe together, or their clan. Mm-hmm. And so these clans are competing with each other. And the beta male just basically has to wait until the alpha male gets old enough and the beta male gets vigorous enough to replace him, right? One particular characteristic that's very interesting, because we're going to talk about sexuality, human sexuality, and I'll just mention it in passing now, that one unique characteristic of humans, aside from the fact that physically humans have intercourse face-to-face, literally face-to-face, right? Every other animal that mates is not face-to-face, with a quasi-exception of the marine mammals. Pinidae came to me, the family or the order of the marine mammals is Pinidae, from pinna, which is fin. They have fins, they have flippers. Right. The chimpanzee female. Oh, yes. So the human is the only one that can, as far as we know, can freely have intercourse at will. I'm talking about sexual intercourse. Every other mammal, the female can only accept the male when she's estrus. Estrus meaning that when she's ovulating, all right? That's the only time that a mammalian female will accept herself to be mounted, to have intercourse, sexual intercourse, to allow the male to mount her, only when she's ovulating. So you can see that's strictly business. It's just for the purpose of reproduction. Except in some chimps, the alpha male is so aggressive with the females, bites them, throws them around, that some females have actually figured out that if they have sexual intercourse, if they allow themselves to be mounted by the alpha male, they drain his testosterone, and the aggressivity goes down for a few hours. So again, it's a very utilitarian thing, but some females have developed, eventually figured out instinctively that if they drained the male, they just figured out that when they were mounted during estrus, the male calmed down. And so some females allow themselves to be mounted just to drain the male. We still have to put it in the context of instinct, okay? We cannot really associate free will with that, or maybe we're too proud to do so. But I think it's still, we have to use the minimalist interpretation, and I think it can still be seen as instinctive because it's a survival thing for the female, right? Then what happens? As you know, primates are very mimicky. The offspring copy their parents, including humans. Children are always copying the parents, and that's the challenge, that children copy adults for good or bad, for better or for worse. So they copy good behavior and also copy bad behavior. If parents respect each other at home, the children likely, there's a greater chance that there'll be respect for children. If parents are at each other's throat and are vulgar and offensive to each other, the children will expect the same from the children as they grow, right? So primates are very mimicky. Again, it comes from a survival thing because they learn how to forage, they learn many things. And so some daughters learn that behavior from their mothers, to give in to the male to drain his testosterone. And so now it's passed on, okay? And you can see how a new cultural trait comes into the pride or whatever they're called, their clan category.
Maybe the other way around too, the males may learn aggression from the father because they realize that they get everything they want if they're aggressive. Absolutely,
definitely that is in, and but that kicked in before the secondary behavior. All right. Yes. So what happened is that exactly. So the chimpanzee was first, and now we have these bonobos around. I don't know how credible this is, but you see that they have their own classification. Pan-paniscus and Pan-troglodytes. So they're the same genus, and they're classified as different species, but I don't know how much of a biological.
It's 99.6% homology.
99.6, that's interesting. Okay, so there's a 0.4% on average. And I imagine that percentage, I would say that that percentage is fairly robust, statistically speaking. Why? Because there's contemporaries. And we can certainly make the sample size large enough to have statistical significance, right? We can make a p-value of maybe 0.001 or something like that. With the confidence, I'm talking about the confidence level. The minimal confidence level, this is a little preview of your statistics scores in the fall. Don't freak out. We do it very easily. But the confidence level, the first standard of confidence level for science, for empirical science, is 95%, right? 95%. When we take the complement of that to 100%, is 5%, right? When we translate 5% to a decimal, is 0.05. And that's what we call the p-value, the probability value. The probability that the opposite would occur is 0.05. That's the minimal standard. The next standard up, the next standard of rigor is 1%, which translate, or 99% sure, 99% sure, or 1% unsure. And that translates as a value of 0.001. And finally, the highest standard is considered very rigorous, especially for scientific articles and journals, is 99.9%, which translates to a p-value of 0.001. Very high, very robust statistic is what we say. So I'm thinking that this statistic of a 0.4% difference is robust. So my big question is, can they mate? Can they intermate? In other words, will a male chimp be able to have fertile offspring? So remember the two characteristics for the biological species, right? That they can mate and that the offspring will be fertile. So I'm gonna leave it as an open question. Will the male chimp mating with a female bonobo, let's say in a zoo situation, let's start with a zoo, maybe not in the wild, but in a zoo, will their offspring, is their offspring fertile or infertile? In other words, is the offspring a species or a hybrid, right? Like the donkey and the mule, the donkey and the horse will give a mule. The mule, some mules can actually be fertile. Some mules can be fertile, but then their offspring is infertile. So finally, maybe we get an F1 generation, but the F2 is infertile, and sooner or later, it's the end of the line. So it'd be interesting if these two guys can mate, or the two, a male bonobo with a female chimp. Probably, I don't know which one is more likely, getting speculative, but I'm saying in the zoo situation, they're restrained, all right? But in the wild, most likely they don't recognize each other because they have different cultures. And also they may look very similar to us, but they look so dissimilar to each other because they're attuned to their fine-tuned characteristics, okay? Just like, I mean this in all, not with offense, but most Asians to me look alike. I have difficulty telling the difference between a Japanese and a Chinese person just at first sight. They probably say the same about us, right? When they look at Caucasians from North America or South America, we could probably tell the difference between an American and a Hispanic, but maybe they cannot. I'm just speculating, but that to them is probably an analogous situation, right? That's just at the level of sight. At the level of smell, it could be very different because now we get into pheromones. And whereas it's still controversial whether humans actually have pheromones or not. But anyway, it doesn't matter because we invented perfume and then that takes care of the pheromone. It's artificial pheromone. But animals, definitely mammals, they all have pheromones or musk or smell big time, all right? So that could also be a barrier, even if they look, let's say, identical. But the bonobo, bottom line, has a benevolent, is not as aggressive as the chimp. And that's their claim to fame. That's the 0.4%, is that they have a more benevolent behavior. So definitely they have to live in regions and they have to occupy it. And the bonobo has to be careful, always has to be on the defensive because if the chimps come in, they'll run them over and they're excluded for the territory. So basically, bottom line, to maintain these two, let's call them species, in the wild, they need large expanses of territory, mostly in equatorial Africa. Okay, so that's why another reason why we need to preserve the Congo Basin and things like that, aside from the big, huge carbon sink that it is, one of the two big lungs of the world, the other lung being, of course, the Amazon Basin. Okay, so Bonobo, still controversial, but it's here. Interesting that they don't put a skull. Probably the skull looks 99.9% or 99.9% as the chimp. Because there's variety. At what point do you draw the line between a species and a variant? I'm going to show you variation on human skulls. Human, Homo sapiens. All right, let's move forward. So we're interested in this break in a little more detail, 6 to 7 million years ago. And here's a diagram. So here's a reference, Barton and Associates, title of the book, Evolution, from 2007. It's good enough for us, okay? So we're looking at the break at the level of now the tribe of hominin, the break of the Homo at the level of Homo. So when did the hominins split? So we have left the Gorolini behind, including the chimp and the bonobo, right? We have left them behind. So now we're into the 6 to 5 million years. We're in here. And this is what we have. See, 5 million years to the present. MYA, million years ago, is the x-axis, typically the independent axis, which is chronological time. And so this from the fossil record.
So the species is 5 million years ago?
Yes, well, we're definitely, in other words, by 5 million years ago, we're definitely in the hominin tribe. And we have left the Gorolini. So the node is beyond the node. That make sense? Okay. Just express if you get lost with the terminology, okay? All right, so this is right, let's say at the node here with Ardipithecus. Now keep in mind, all of these are extinct. All of these are extinct, but they have been given a scientific classification, scientific name, to try to place them on the phylogenetic tree of the human, the ancestry, all right? So what is considered to be the node is someone called Sahelanthropus, and that would be at the level of genus. And it's a reference to the name is very informative. Thanks be to God, they didn't become, they didn't become egotistical about it, and it wasn't the researcher's last name that named the fossil, all right? Because you have two options. You find when you discover a new species, one option is to give it an informative name, and the other option is to give it an egocentristic name. All right, so this one, thanks be to God, is informative. Anthropoid is a reference to human-like. Anthropos is a reference to human-like. And Sahel is a reference to the border of the Sahara. The Sahel. The Sahara, we know, is a huge desert. Well, stick with the slides. I have one further down. This is an actual photograph, satellite photograph. This is obviously the Sahara. North of the Sahara is an ocean, so we can only go south on land. And this is the Congo Basin, one of the two natural lungs of the world, Lake Victoria, etc., Great Rift Valley, Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa. And the Sahel is the boundary between the Sahara and the equatorial Africa. Equatorial Africa, the equator goes right through here. Okay. And the Sahara is actually expanding. So the Sahel is a very delicate boundary that is constantly being invaded by Sahara sands. Very challenging. So there's a desertification process going on here. Challenging. Anyway, that's the Sahel. And this is where many, many anthropoid bones have been found, fossils. So Sahelanthropus is a reference to the common node here. Then going into the hominin.
The common node was at the blue point where
yeah.
Diverged, so that's Sahelanthropus right there. That would be the node.
Right, somewhere in here. Right, the common ancestor, the LCA, the last common ancestor between homini and gorillini, would have been this Sahelanthropus. And the date is there. Okay, moving then into the hominiid tribe.
Father Shafi.
Yes.
I know we're going to be talking about the soul and all that, but what we're saying here is that something very similar to who we are today was there 5 million years ago.
Yes, similar, yeah, but similar in what sense? Okay, we always have to ask the question, qualify it. In what sense? Similar in what sense? I would say similar anatomically and physiologically, but in general, similar, okay? We're gonna get much more particular to that. We're gonna get much more narrow. Okay, so similar anatomically and physiologically. Maybe bipedal, maybe not, at least for some period of time. But, you know, for example, even the chimp is bipedal for some time, but then eventually they have to go down into all fours. And I'll talk more detail about that. So just hang on to your question. You'll see how it becomes clarified. There's similarity. Remember, we did a little analysis and we have similarity with a fly, right? Percentage homology was, I think, 40 or 60%. Amazing. So similar how? Well, we metabolize and we have nuclei in our cells. So in a very broad sense. Let's get more specific, okay? We start getting into these Australopithecus. Again, the name is informative because Australo means southern, just like Australia is the southern continent. All right. So Austral is a reference to the southern hemisphere. Pithecus is a reference to monkey or monkey-like. Australopithecine. So the southern monkeys. Afarensis is a region, the Afar region in Africa, near Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa. So Australopithecus afarensis is a reference, we translate the name into contemporary English, would be the southern monkey-like creature that was found in the Afar region of equatorial Africa. Then a node. We continue with the Australopithecus africanus. This is a reference that maybe had a little broader range in other parts of Africa that were not the Afar region. Fossils were found in other parts of Africa that were outside of the Afar region, various parts. It may not have been many fossils, but a few in a broader region of Africa, so they call it Australopithecus africanus. I'm just speculating a little bit how these names came about, right? But there's a note there because there is Paranthropus Ethiopikus. Now this one is also very formative as level of the species. Ethiopikus is a reference to modern day Ethiopia, which is the Horn of Africa. Again, this guy here. Known as the Horn of Africa, right? It goes into the Indian Ocean, basically. Here's Madagascar. So this is modern day Ethiopia. This is the Arabic Peninsula, etc. All right. So they branch off and basically go south. We want to go north here. There's some unknown species. This is what we call the missing link, right? There is a speculative node here, which is a Homo species, but the fossil has not been found yet. It's speculated because we have fossils of Homo habilis, and we have also fossils of Homo rudolfensis. Here's where it gets ecocentristic. I guess Rudolf is the one who found this fossil. Not exactly sure, but rudolfensis is not a reference to a place that I know of or a quality. So alternative, it could be a reference to the last name Rudolf. Then we continue, so Homo habilis stays here by itself. We continue on this branch. Now these are all homos, so we're already into the genus. Okay, we're into the genus Homo. And there's speculation about this link here, this node, which would be what we call classically a missing link, right? Then the map is a little more full, which is interesting because these are actual fossils. There is ergaster. Ergaster is a reference to standing erect. Ergaster is a reference to standing erect, right? Bipedal, fully bipedal. Erectus is more, or I should say that ergaster is rising, whereas erectus is fully erect. So ergaster is in the process of rising, of becoming fully bipedal. But erectus is fully bipedal. Then we get into Heidelbergensis, which is a reference to the town of Heidelberg in Germany, where this fossil was found. Definitely within Europe. So there's migration out of Africa. And then finally, the last split that we know of that is fairly well documented from the fossil record, even live tissue, because not live tissue, but soft tissue, because we have soft tissue from Neanderthals from Europe. They go back as recently as maybe 40,000 years ago. That's very, very recent in geologic time. You know, definitely less than 500,000 years. It's estimated that Neanderthals coincided with sapiens in Europe up to about 40,000 years ago. It's amazing. So we definitely have soft tissue from Neanderthal. The genome of Neanderthal has been deciphered. All right? So the Homo sapiens is started 2.5 million years ago. That's the big question. That's the big question. When there's a window from, we can say as far back as 2 million or as recent as 200,000. That's the range. The broad range is about 2 million years ago. And the narrow range is about 200,000 years ago. So this is showing in the narrow range, obviously. So at least at the level of genus, so the level of genus, we started about 2 million years ago. At the level of species, 200,000. So let's continue and look at the other homos that are not sapiens. These are known, oh, sorry. I'm going to go out here just for the sake of completion and look at these three fossils because they're named because there's an actual fossil. As opposed to this node here, the missing link, we don't have a fossil, so there's no name. But once there's a name, it means that it's based on a fossil. And the reconstruction of the fossil, which is very, very interesting because this gets into anatomy and physiology, which is it's an interesting science and it's a developed science. All right, so this is the southern apes, Australopithecines. And there's about a dozen different species there. These are some large representatives. Sahelanthropus, I spoke about Sahelanthropus, right? The human-like from the Sahel, Sahelanthropus. Ardipithecus, again, Pithecine is a reference to ape, Pithecine, Pithecus. RD, I don't know what the RD reference is. Australo, southern, this just means southern ape. These are the actual fossils reconstructed, okay, put together. There's a lot of computer tomography that goes into this, but this is, it's amazing. So much has been found. You can see definitely more and more human-like, even though they're still in the Australopithecine line. They're not really in the Homo line. And you can see how the skull becomes more and more human-like. It's amazing. The brow recesses in, the sockets become more rounded and forward-looking, so on and so forth, many, many characteristics. The brain, the skull, the brain, the cranium becomes ever larger, so on and so forth. But that's still on this southern branch here. Okay. Then what they do is, once they have the bone structure of the entire skull, they can fill in, if they have these many fragments, they can fill in what's missing by computer tomography and eventually generate just a cast model of the full cranium, of the full skull, including the mandibles, upper jaw, lower jaw, with all the denture. And then anatomists and physiologists come in and place the layers of soft tissue, beginning with the muscles and tendons and ligaments that are attached to these bones. For example, the masseter muscle, which is a very strong muscle, it's one of the strongest muscles in the body, if not the strongest. If you place your hands by your cheek and just open and close your mouth for a moment, you feel the masseter muscle expanding and contracting. So the bite, the human bite, is a very strong bite. It's a very dangerous bite also. And that's the masseter muscle that is attached here and here. And so you put the muscle, you put the tendons that attach the muscle to the bone, you put the ligaments that attach bone to bone, and so on. So now you got the muscle structure. And then on top of the muscle structure, you put the dermis, or you put the adipose tissue, otherwise known as fat, conjunctive tissue. Then you put the dermal tissue. And on top of the dermal, finally, you put the epidermis, including the hair and the pigmentation. And this is a reconstruction of these guys, which is a model, but it looks very, very real. It's a photograph of a model. These are all fossils. Amazing. Yeah, incredible. And yet there it is. And it's all based on the fossil record. So it's empirical. Yes. Yes, typically they're crashed, but they are in the same region, in the same area. And so it's a very detailed, sometimes these anthropologists, when they're working on these sites, they even go down to a brush and a pencil brush to swipe away fine sand and so forth. And so sometimes they take the whole thing and take it to a lab where they can work. Sometimes they'll work on these for years, and a whole team of them. They're precious. But there it is. So next time you run into a fundamentalist, you may want to show them one of these and say, what is this? Okay, timeline. Million years. Now the timeline is in the y-axis. Don't get thrown off by that, okay? From the present, drilling down to the past. So you can think of this as geologic strata, drilling down 2 million years, precisely the beginning of the Homo. So this would be that missing link node of the first Homo, the first hypothetical Homo. Because if we have a Rudolphensis on one side and we have habilis on the other side, going through ergaster and then again splitting into erectus and antecessor, this is another one. So that's why I say it's from a dozen to a half a dozen, more or less, because here it gets technical. And these are experts who name these guys, but they're still controversial. You know, there's no consensus. It starts getting very fuzzy, very sketchy, because this belongs, basically, this is a domain of 1 or 2 labs in the world. That PI, that principal investigator, is an anthropologist, biologist, anatomist who has all these fields background, you know, but they're very specialized. So when they pin a name to these guys, it's still controversial. You know, it's a work in progress. It's a work in progress. So this is equivalent to, let's say, an experimental procedure in clinical, in medicine. It's a procedure, but it's experimental because it has not been standardized yet. All right. So that's equivalent, kind of an analogy to the naming of these. That's why we go from half a dozen to a dozen species of the Homo genus, depending on how they classify it. Yes, it happens in bacteria, right? So it's a moving target, right? And they mutate, and so all of a sudden, is this a variety or is this a species? All right, that was Darwin's point, by the way. Anyway, so here's sapiens, right? And that's why this would be 200,000 years, and this is 2 million years. So you see there's an order of magnitude in between. It's an order of magnitude. So when we talk about Homo sapiens, are we talking about at the level of sapiens or at the level of Homo? Because the species includes the genus. All right, so meet our closest neighbors. This is still on the genus side, drilling into genus, but going all the way from habilis 2 million years ago to Neanderthalis 40,000 years ago. All right, so 2 million to 1.5 million. Based on the fossil record, this is what they would look like each. So you compare, to make the most gross comparison between habilis and Neanderthalis, of the two, definitely Neanderthal looks much more human-like, and habilis looks much more ape-like. But then there's a range in between. There's a range. And it all depends also how much pigmentation you put on these. So this Heidelbergensis, even though he or she was discovered in Germany, Europe has an African pigmentation, very dense melanin, right? Which is okay because, I mean, when we talk about Europe, we think of contemporary Europe, which can be pretty cold in the summer, in the winter, but it could have been a tropicalized Europe where there was more UV. But Neanderthalis definitely we associate with Europe and therefore has less pigmentation. So it's an approximation, okay? Even though these two fossils were found in the same geographical region, they were found at different times. And this older time may have been a more tropicalized Earth, justifying the darker pigmentation. In other words, the melanin to survive skin cancer, which can be deadly, right? So there's selection there. Selective pressure by UV, and so on and so forth. But all of these beyond Heidelberg, or before Heidelbergensis, need to have a lot of melanin because they're basically African. In other words, the fossils were found in Africa. There's some that have been found in Asia, what is today China, and so we talk about Sinanthropus, a reference to Sina or Sine or China, Sinanthropus. So the big question is, when might we posit a soul? We're convinced that we have a soul, and I'll give you some actual tangible evidence for that. But how have these guys? We have to look at their material culture, what is known as material culture, in other words, what's left behind by them. Okay, what's left behind. in their campfires or their mittens. The mitten is the burial places, or just where they, not the burial places, but their garbage cans, their garbage heaps, what they ate and what they threw out and so forth. So that also tells us, it's informative. They tell us what they ate, how they ate it, and so forth, and how they procured the food. Mostly hunter-gatherer, right? All right, now, skulls. Since we have skulls now, we can go to town on the mania of measuring size and volume, because once we have a skull, we want to know the volume, because the volume can tell us more or less the brain volume and more or less the brain capacity, because we tend to associate brain activity with volume, with size. So starting with the Panini, which is a contemporary, this is the chimp brain today. Chimp brain today, all right? So you have to be careful. A caveat is that we're using a contemporary Panini to compare with a contemporary human, which have 3 times the volume. So a contemporary chimp has cubic centimeters of about 400. Their brain, 400 cubic centimeters. Whereas our brain average is about 1355. We round it up to 15 or round it down to 12, either way. So it's about 3 or 4 times the size of the brain of a chimp, just by volume. It says nothing about the convolutions. Remember, the upper function of the brain, which is abstract thoughts, occurs on the cortex, in other words, the surface of the brain. And when you have convolution, in other words, the sulci and the gyri, the parts of the brain that go in and out, the cortex, when we expand it out, it's a much broader surface. So by wrinkling a surface, right, by wrinkling a surface, we gain brain activity, if you will, in a smaller size, because we can put a larger surface in a smaller volume. And that's basically what the convolutions of the brain does. In other words, the folding in and out, right? Which are called sulci and gyri. It's just a Latin name because we don't want people to understand what we're talking about. All right, so bottom line is we have 4 times the brain capacity by volume than the chimp, contemporary to contemporary. That's the 1%. Now, if we fill in the fossil record here just by brain volume, where do they fall? All right, here's Australopithecus, for example, just maybe 10% more than the contemporary chimp, Australopithecus. Now we go into the Homo line, into the genus, Homo genus, 2 words, right? About 2 million years ago, habilis, again, is the oldest Homo fossil record that we have. Over 500, so it's increased by 1/4, 400 to 500, or 450 to 550. Erectus, 1,000. So here's a big jump, and you can see it physically. Twice the brain size, from habilis to erectus. That's why you see there's an intermediate, ergaster, but from habilis to erectus, double the cranium size, cranium volume. Again, it just gives us a hint about the soft tissue, the brain, but no details with regards to the convolutions. But this is a big jump, double the volume. And then from erectus to Neanderthal, triple the volume. And in fact, from Neanderthal to Sapiens, a diminishing of volume. The average Neanderthal volume is over 1,500 cubic centimeters, right? 1,500 or cc's. You want to put it in liquid, a measure. Whereas our average brain is 1350. So we actually lost 200 cc's, right? And yet we wiped them out, competitive exclusion principle. So this is telling us that the brain size is not a maximal thing, but it's an optimal thing. In other words, maximal will be that the larger the brain, the more fit the individual or the species, like Neanderthal. By those lights, Neanderthal should have replaced sapiens. And that means that we would all be Neanderthals instead of sapiens. We're not. So maximal brain size is Neanderthal. Neanderthal has a larger brain capacity, right? Brain, at least by the volume. Yeah, so it's not maximal, it's not maximal, it's optimal, right? Optimal meaning that with our lesser brain size, we actually got to displace Neanderthal. So there comes a point, what this is trying to say, maybe a little speculatively, is that with regards to the brain, there comes a point where a larger size is not necessarily an evolutionary advantage. It may actually be a disadvantage somehow, because we sapiens with a smaller brain overall displaced Neanderthal that had a larger brain and was also more robust, more fit. Physically, I'm talking about anatomical fitness. I'm talking about the gym. I'm talking about muscle mass and bone structure. So maybe that was their advantage. They were not as agile. Maybe with tool making and tools and maybe more sophisticated weaponry, our brain capacity was sufficient. And actually, we were more agile. So there was an evolutionary advantage in being overall smaller. Smaller biomass, smaller overall bone structure, muscle mass, and actual brain size. Maybe weighs less, right? So it's easier to move around, to go faster, longer. I don't know, I'm speculating, but this is a fact, right? And this number on the Neanderthal brain volume is robust because quite a few Neanderthals have been found, fossils, non-living yet. All right, I want to shift gears a little bit because in the background of all this is always a fossil record. We have a few dozen, except for the chimp and the human, we have a few individual skulls, maybe a few dozen skulls of each species. For Neanderthal, I think there are at least several dozen, maybe hundreds of skulls. So the statistic is more robust, right? The number is more robust. But for the others, really, just a few skulls. And I want to point out again, so the question is, how representative is it? There's obviously a range in skull. It's a polymorphic characteristic. You understand polymorphism now, right? It's a polymorphic characteristic, just like the size of humans, the height of humans, the average adult male, the average adult female. There's a range from the very tall to the very short. Most of us are in the mid-range of what is the norm, but there is a range. Well, the same with the skull. There's a range. And so, for example, here is just an example of contemporary human skull range. Just 4 of them, different views. And this is actually CT. This is computer tomography. So this is not a drawing or a speculation. This is an actual photograph, if you will, a reconstruction of skulls. Look how different. It's amazing. Look at the eye sockets over here compared to this other one looking from underneath, taking a photograph from underneath. How do you take that photo? Well, with some kind of a resonance. Look how different. This is the foramen magnum. The spinal cord goes through here. Right? This one is almost round from the bottom up. This one is very elongated. Sideways, forward, front, frontal. These are all human. These are all Homo sapiens sapiens. If they were male and female, in principle, they could mate and produce fertile offspring for any number of F generations, right? Look how physiologically different the skull is. So this is just variance. Now, which one represents the human? Compare these two guys looking at the profile. This person is fat-faced. This person, maybe they sucked their thumb or something until they were 30 years old, because look at how the front teeth are bulging out. Right? There it is. So if there's variation in contemporary human skulls, there's certainly variation in any one of these skulls. And so how representative? Why the skull that has been found, the fossil that has been found, why does that have to be the norm? Maybe it's not the norm. Maybe it's off on the edge somewhere, extremely, we don't know. So the more we found, the more robust the anatomy becomes, okay? But keep in mind, this goes back to a limit factor, which is the paucity of the fossil record. That argument is across the board for any species, for any fossil that we find, including the dinos. So these reconstructions are approximations. These reconstructions are approximations. How do we know that this is the average phase of these guys? Well, we don't, because we don't know that these, how representative of the species are these individual skulls, because these are individual skulls, deterministic, right? Whereas these, oh, that's interesting. So the skulls are deterministic, but the reconstruction are probabilistic. The average. We assume that this is how they looked, just because we want to assume it. All right, another correlation. This is an interesting, at least association. Association. So the, correlation is a stronger word than association, right? Because like I say, association does not imply correlation, that the one follows the other, but at least association. What do we have? Technical cultural innovation is the gray line, right? This gray line, which is an average, and it's tracing what we know as material culture, stuff that we have left behind. For example, beads, clothing, remains of charcoal, fire charcoal, or the garbage that we ate and is thrown out, right? So that's material culture. And you can see it, it's traced here. Shell fishing, for example, this one. I don't know if this can be made a little larger so you can see the wording. Okay, so what is shell fishing? Remember, hunter-gatherers, the nature is economic, so the mind is lazy, so we try to do the minimal work to survive, and even more so primitive humans. Then the minimal work, if one is in a coastal region and there is shellfish around, it's easier to catch the shellfish because they're not moving too fast, like clams and oysters and conchs and all that, as opposed to a fish that is actually swimming or a bird that is actually flying. So I catch the shells, I eat the inside, and I toss the shell. So that's shell fishing, right? And when we anthropologists discover empty shells of clams and oysters next to a coastal camp of these primitive humans, we can assume safely that that's what they ate. It's shellfish. Okay? So you can trace it up. Microliths is a reference, lithos is a reference to fire. And micro is little charred remains that were left on the campfire of maybe the bone of a fish that was cooked on the campfire. So cooking is a cultural behavior. What other animal do you know that cooks? None. We cook them, but they don't cook anything. So cooking is a cultural advantage. It's pre-digested food. It starts digestion outside the body. And so we get more nourishment out of cooked food than out of raw food. I still love sushi. Right, so you see here, barbed points, definitely made, but it's a cultural thing, you know. It's a spearhead or an arrowhead. Bone tools and incised pieces. Incision is just a carving, typically on a bone, but it could be a carving on a wood or on a stone. So this is cultural behavior. And we trace that, so on and for beads, making beads. Even the little beads that have a hole through them, that's a very sophisticated technique for that time. How do you make a little hole through it? First, how do you make a round bead out of stone that is tiny, and then drill a hole through that? That's pretty sophisticated for way back. Where's the time frame on this? Like 50,000 years ago. We didn't have the tools that we have today. 50,000 years ago, I forget when when the metal age was, but probably not metals. Oh, here it is, metal age.
Would the presence of beads be considered a decrease in selective pressures? Because you have to have time to
right.
React.
Exactly. Yes.
It's not really productive.
Right.
Just having fun.
Thank you. The big jump here was precisely agriculture. So from hunter-gatherer to harvester, which was somewhat gradual, but also kind of abrupt. Okay, so hunter-gatherer, basically we're following the herds and we're following the game. And if we live in a tropical region where there are more fruit trees and tubers and stuff that we can eat, plant that doesn't move around, that's even easier. That's the gathering part, right? The hunter is more difficult. So it's more northern territories where there is seasons, weather seasons. So, but the transition from hunter-gatherer to harvester, basically, and farmer of animals, in other words, domestication of, in North America, of the turkey, in Europe, some other kind of mammal there that eventually became a sheep or a goat or something like that, right? And so domestication and agriculture, which is supposed to have happened about 7,000 years ago in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, Babylonia, between the confluence of the two rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, basically what is Iran and Iraq today. That's where we say the agricultural origin of modern man. Agricultural origin, about 7,000 years ago, more or less. And that was synergistic. That catapulted humans precisely into a luxury of material culture because we became sedentary as opposed to nomadic or quasi-nomadic. All right, so it did give us the time because now those humans had enough food to settle down and to stick around for the next harvest as opposed to following the herds all over the place or literally hunting. Right, and so agricultural origin of modern man, about 7,000 years ago. Cultural origin of modern man, very different. Cultural origin is classical Greece, basically about 400 BC. So kind of 700, it's an order of magnitude less. The cultural origin of modern civilization, mostly to classical Greece, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. Right, so let me small this up again so that we can look at the big picture, the overall picture.
You said 7,000 agriculture?
7,000 agriculture,
Years ago.
yes, yes, agricultural. And cultural, about 700 about 300-400 BC, so 500. I'm trying to round up the numbers so that they match the order of magnitude. Right, so what is being done here in this graph? You have this material culture innovation, which is growing exponentially, right? You see, it's not linear, it's logarithmic. And this is associated with agriculture, with going from hunter-gatherer to sedentary, so from nomad to sedentary, basically. It's almost like a sinusoid curve, sinusoid. Anyway, then we match up the skulls on the time. So here's the, so when we have a curve going through a graph, certainly we have a vertical axis, which is the cubic centimeters or, cubic centimeters or volume from 400, again, chimpanzee-like brain, to 2000, which is beyond even, it's 500 cc beyond Neanderthal. And then that's on the y-axis, which is the dependent axis. On the x-axis, chronology, time. But you notice, again, it's not linear, all right? The scales are not linear. Look at the distance between 400 and 500 cc, and the distance between 1,000 and 2,000. Okay, so it's not linear scale, it's a logarithmic scale just to fit it in. If we put it linear, the graph becomes too huge. So to put a logarithmic scale on both axes, it just compresses the graph. It's more visual. It concentrates the data. But anyway, look at the scale on the x-axis, going back to 2.5 million years ago. And as recent, the most recent break is 100,000 years ago, all right? And now what they've done here is they've populated, aside from the cultural innovation here, which you can see it goes exponential, right? They've populated the graph with the skulls that have been found by date and clusters. All right, so for example, this one down here, you see the yellow solid squares is Paranthropus, which is definitely on the Gorillini Panini family, on the tribe. Gorillini Panini, so these are the ancestors to the gorillas and to the chimps, right? After the node, after the common node with the hominins. They're populated down here. And they're populated according to brain skull size. So there's a variety that has been found of these fossils, variation. And so that's the population there of the fossils that have been found of these Paranthropy. The next one up is the, let's say, the open triangles. So further information, the yellow color is on the Panini Gorillini tribe, but the red color is on the hominini tribe, All right, so there's a distinction between yellow and red. We are on the red, sapiens. Then let's look at the different shapes. So open triangles are habilis, the oldest Homo that we have a record of, fossil record, right? Open triangles. That's their population here. Then we go more cc's, more cubic centimeters. We have Erectus, ergaster, and Rhodesiensis. This is another one. Rhodesiensis is a reference to Rhodes, Rhoda, which is an island, the island of Rhodes down in the Aegean Sea, south of Greece. All right, the island of Rhodes. There was the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, way back. All right, so they're closer, even though there are 3 species, yes, but their average CC, it's about the same. The average CC, so they're populated here. Between 600 and 700 CCs, see them? All right, let's go further up. Now let's go to, oh, I'm sorry, this was solid square, open square. Open square is actually a big range. You can see the open square is a big range. Here they are. So it's quite a bit, from 700 to 1300 cc, almost double. That's the range there. Okay, how about we go to the archaic Homo sapiens and archaic Helmei. This is another species there. Solid square is here. That's a solid square. Asian erectus, solid triangle here. That's the erectus. European, Heidelbergensis, Neanderthal, solid circle. Up here, you see the CCs are increasing. And now, dig this. Anatomically modern human, meaning 200,000 years or, well, no, anatomically, I guess about 50,000 years back, all right? Is the white circle. It's quite a range, huh? From 1,000 to above 1,800. It's quite a range, quite a broad range. It's all here. But what's interesting is then now let's look at the numbers. The numbers are categories. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I guess 2 categories are clustered here because I see 7 here, but only 6 numbers. So what have they omitted? Well, anyway, the numbers represent slopes. Slope is interesting because the slope gives us a trend. See, and we either have a positive slope or we have a negative slope, right? What is the trend of the fossils that have been found so far? So that's a limit factor, okay? Agreed that this is based only on the fossils that have been found. Even so, the slope of the Gorolini Panini tribe that have been found has a positive slope, very positive slope, right? Quite steep positive. In other words, that is hinting at a fast development of the cranium volume. The same with on the Hominini side. Now red is Hominini tribe. This is Hominini tribe red. 2 represents the slope of the triangles, habilis and rudolfensis. These are the first Homo genus. Very even more steep slope, almost vertical, right? And going from about 500 to about 900 cc's. So very steep growth in skull size. 3 also, now the African Homos, Erectus, Ergaster, Rudolfensis, no, Rhodesiensis, sorry. Also, very steep slope, but shifted up on the cubic centimeters. Then we start getting into Asian. These are the solid triangles. Asian. So now we're out of Africa. So the first 3 are within Africa, the last 3 are out of Africa. So that's after the migration, which could have been 1 or several. That's still controversial. How many migrations out of Africa of the Homo species, Homo genus, right? So these last 3, there's still a positive slope for 4 and 5, more moderate growth, more moderate. So it looks like the cubic cc's is slowing down, increasing cubic cc's. But then finally, the sixth slope is actually a negative slope. In other words, this is representing this, going from the skull of a Neanderthal to the skull of a sapiens. There has been a decrease, right, in the volume. So this is represented graphically this way. There's the solid circle is European Homo, whereas the open circle is anatomically modern humans, including you and I. The decrease there, the negative slope, represents graphically the decrease. But we're already in an exponential growth of culture. So the transition is basically here. And the transition is precisely from nomad to sedentary. And sedentary allows for an expansion, for an explosion of culture, of material culture, including tools and tools that make tools, right? All the way to launching rockets into space and launching humans into space, surviving in no atmosphere, surviving in quote unquote empty space. And so we can see that basically the cultural equivalent of an expansive radiation happened with sedentary, with the discovery and the harnessing of agriculture, of food available. All right. Yes.
So this graph, is that in the chapter that you're...
Yes, this is from, no, actually, no, I'm sorry. I probably need to put the reference of this because this I found online. Yeah, my bad. I should put the reference on this. Yeah. Okay, now we're going to go into anatomically modern human and how the shift occurred, but it's already 11:40, so maybe we take a few minutes break. Yeah, all right, and come back for the final sprint here, the last hour or so, maybe less than an hour. So how about we come back in 10 minutes? I'll start again at 11:50, all right? So I'll start back again at 11:50. Any pressing questions or comments? No? Good time to break? All right, so pause recording. Okay, folks, I'm resuming recording. So let's go forward. We were over here. All right. Now, little formative slides here of the hominin line. We are the only one that species that is living currently, all right? And there's at least half a dozen extinct from the fossil record, maybe up to a dozen, depending on how they're classified. And again, that's a work in progress because it's a very specialized field and few individuals in the world are really competent to classify these fossils, all right? A lot depends on the reconstruction, how much of the fossil is found. We don't always find a skull necessarily. Sometimes it's another bone of the body, of the different part of the body, right? So some biological characteristics still of the hominin tribe, the level of tribe, is this bipedalism, which is very important because it frees up the hands. It frees up the four limbs, F-O-R-E limbs, the forward limbs for tool making, all right? For tool making. So some main characteristics are in the increased brain size that we talked about, at least 3 times larger than the node between the hominins and the gorillins, or even I saw there paninins. That's a reference to pan, which is pan troglodytes, which is the chimpanzee and the bonobo. making tools, and harnessing fire, using fire, right? So just emphasizing that that's the break more or less, at least from the fossil record.
What was the technical term you used for being able to harness fire or make fire?
Yeah, using fire, harnessing fire. Yeah. Oh, lith, yeah, it's called lithic culture, actually. Lithic culture. Yeah, sure. Lithic. All right. Now, let's look at this bipedalism for a while because the freeing of the hands is spectacular, all right? This is a skeleton of Pantroglodytes. It's a skeleton of a chimp and the skeleton of a human. We have the skeleton of a chimp across the hallway over there when you walk in and out that other classroom across the hallway in the vitrina. What do you say, the vitrina in English? What do you say, the display window? There's a skeleton of a chimp there, all right? And you can see definitely on all fours. This is called knuckle walking, knuckle walking. They walk on their knuckles because knuckle, how do you spell knuckle? The KN, yeah, KNO, right? Yeah, exactly, knuckle, los nudillos. Right, this is what happens. Their spine is curved, but a single curvature, whereas our spine is a double curvature. Actually, a triple when you consider the caudal region. Caudal region is a tailbone, but they're fused and embedded inside the lower part of our body, of our trunk. So the curvature, the S curvature is what allows us to be erect, because when there's no S, when there's just a C, basically the single curvature on the spine, the upper body is projected forward. And so it's very top heavy, if you will. And so the chimp can walk on two, you see them walking around, how they walk, right? That's not a laughter. They're actually showing their canines. It's an aggression movement when they're walking back and forth, the chimp. And we saw, is it still around? Yeah, when they walk around. Oh, this is vulnerable. Oh, let's see it. Knuckle walking. And you. And you see it. Yeah, the gorillas do it also. Basically, they get up on two, and then they have to drop down. They get up on their hind legs for a while, but eventually they have to drop down to their forward knuckles because the spine is a C and not an S. But when the spine becomes an S, now the center of gravity will fall squarely on top of the hips. The black X, the black cross is the center of gravity. So the center of gravity for the chimp, you can see, is around here somewhere, whereas the center of gravity for the human is squarely on top of the hips, which then branches down to the legs. Bottom line, we can hold our full weight standing up indefinitely, in principle, but the chimps and the gorillas can't. They have the capacity to walk on two legs, on the hind legs for a while, but at some point they have to fall forward again because they get tired. They cannot hold the weight. The center of gravity is displaced. All right, so how could this happen? If our ancestor was not knuckle walking, but our ancestor was actually using all four, well, there's evidence, climatological evidence, that the climate change precisely in Northern Africa going from a tropical rainforest to a bush savanna. And the transition was a tree savanna. So what does this mean? Tropical rainforest is dense with understory and canopy and trees, right? So to move around a tropical rainforest, it's much easier to hang from the trees and to go from branch to branch. So all four limbs, and you notice the orangutan can do that. And because the orangutan is arboreal, specifically the hind legs can grasp, can apprehend, can grasp, right? Because the toe is opposed, the big toe is opposed to the other four toes, opposite, so they can grasp with all four, and they hang around literally up on a tropical rainforest. That's where they live, I think in Sumatra, in Southeast Asia, which is a tropical rainforest. Okay, so the mode of locomotion here is holding on and grabbing and moving from branch to branch by all four legs. But there was a climatological change. This desertification started getting drier. So fewer plants were able to survive, and basically there was a transition from a forest to a savanna, going through a tree savanna where fewer and fewer trees were available, to eventually what is known as a bush savanna, which is what we have today, which is the prairie. And so the locomotion here, the standard locomotion for primates is going to be bipedal. So this could have been the selective pressure for going bipedal, literally getting off the trees onto the ground. Even to this day, we see that our closest contemporaries, the chimps and the gorillas and the bonobo, live mostly on the bush savanna. They go into the forest for protection and for foraging and so forth, but they're out in the open. They prefer in the open. And there was a transition. Let me see if I can put this back where it belongs. From, oops. What is estimated to have been about 14 million years ago, all right? 14 million, keep in mind, if we transition at 6 million on the hominin line. So the level of family, probably we're still sharing a common ancestor 14 million years ago. This is tropicalized Africa. You can see the black line represents the equator. There was much more tropical rainforest in the whole continent. It was a more tropicalized Earth. Right now, we're kind of in transition because we're not a fully tropicalized Earth. Why are we not fully tropicalized Earth? What do we have on land that is very evident? And we still have solid water. We have the 2 ice caps. But notice the boundary of the continent here for tropicalized Earth, right? Notice the boundaries of the continents. Yes, not so much that it shifted, it got flooded. Exactly, so here's Africa, back 14 million years ago, estimate where it was, and they can determine this just by the low-lying areas. And superimposed white line is today's contour, today's coastline. So the superimposed white line is today's coastline, right? Look at the Arabic Peninsula used to be an island, right? It's a subplate, it's a small, tiny subplate, tectonic plate, but it was an island. In other words, the Suez Straits, I think, I forget if the Suez Straits was here or here. No, Suez Canal is here, right? Between Arabia and Africa. Yeah. Now, this is the desert. This is the Arabic desert today. So land, but back then it was flooded because tropicalized Earth means that the two poles are melted and therefore there's more water, liquid water, and there's flooding. That's why we're prime target number one. With tropicalized Earth, Florida will go back to being a reef, a coral reef. We'll have an average of 100 to 200 feet of water on top of us. And that's where the sand came from, because this used to be a coral reef back in tropicalized Earth, right? I'll show you a diagram of that, actually a time lapse when we get into the environmental bioethics course. So anyway, two things about this map approximation, it's a reconstruction. First, Africa was smaller, surrounded totally by ocean, right? So you can see that the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean were contiguous and framed Africa on the north and east and west, and then Southern Atlantic on the bottom, and Indian also. But basically, the coastline was smaller, and also the whole continent, by and large, was tropical rainforest, much smaller patches of desert. Basically, three little patches of desert. But today, yeah. Today, this is an actual photograph, satellite photograph. So this is how it looks, unquestionably. Right? As I mentioned, the Sahara has been expanding over the millions of years, and the Sahara is the boundary that continues to impinge down. So there has been a gradual but sure desertification, less humidity. So this transition is a very plausible transition from a tropical rainforest to a bush savanna, going through an intermediate of tree savanna. These are mostly acacia trees that are hardy, resistant to dry climate. So this could have been the selective pressure for going bipedal, bottom line, because once our ancestors got off the trees, now, and being that we're not top carnivores, we're actually omnivores, right? You know what omnivore is? Our denture, our teeth structure tells us we have canines for tearing through, but we also have molars for grinding, and we have incisors for clipping the different types of teeth, different shapes of teeth. That tells us our feeding behavior. So we eat animals and plants, but we're not top carnivores because we don't have pronounced canines and degenerate molars, okay? So we're omnivores, we're not top carnivores, which means that on the savanna, where there are top carnivores like lions and other even opportunistic carnivores like hyenas, they would be after us. And so the faster we run, the better we are off with the top carnivore that's right behind us. It is faster to run on two than to run on four legs. Yeah. Even the longest bones of our body is the femur. So you see there was definitely a selective pressure, climatological, and then animal pressure, prey, predator, to run faster and to run through the bush in two legs as opposed to four. Yes, yes, yes. And even though these are all contemporary pictures, so they're actually different parts of the world, some in different parts, but I just wanted to illustrate what a tropical rainforest would look like, very dense. Whereas the savanna, you have some trees, harder to get around, easier to be on the ground, to where you have full savanna. Now you gotta run for your life, literally. All right, so we see that transition has happened over a dozen million years ago, so it allows for evolution to occur. Let me go into the culture. Lithic also, sorry, you know, lithos, as I'm thinking now, lithos is a reference to stone, not to, yeah, to rocks, not to fire. I'm sorry. So lithic culture is a reference to all the Stone Age. Yeah, so lithic culture is a reference to stone, not to fire. My bad. So I should. Change this. Okay, here we go. These are remains, chars that have been found, right? And they have been found typically in caves, but also out in the field. And what's interesting is not just the tool that is used as a knife or as a spear head or as a lance head or an arrowhead, but actually to make that knife. Okay, so take one stone and hit it against another stone, and the other stone is the knife. But the stone that I use as a hammer, that is a tool that is making another tool. Why am I making this point? Because we have a few animals that use tools. Very primitive, but they do. For example, our friend the chimp. What do? They take a stick, and with a stick, they poke that stick into a termite hole. And what happens is the termites go on top of the stick. Then the chimp pulls out the stick and eats the termites. Okay, not too tasty, but it's a tool. They're hunting for termites. In fact, some birds use some tools also, crows in particular that tend to be very smart. Crows use a twig to pull things around and to poke things. And otters go into the bottom. They grab a clam or something from down there, and then they take a stone and they turn belly up. The otter turns belly up and hits the clam with a stone and breaks the clam. Okay, so that's also a tool.
I have to say, I also know that chimps have favorite rocks, and they'll carry them in their mouth with them.
No kidding! Oh,
and then they'll take the rock and they'll use it to break open nuts.
Wow, there you go. And they have their own tools, personalized tools. Yeah, don't get into my tools because we can get into trouble. Yeah, some otters take stones to hit the clams to open them up, right? Oh, here's one. Here's the clam and here's the stone. Yeah. So other animals use tools, but we have yet to find an animal that makes a tool, right? Which requires another tool. And we have gotten extremely sophisticated. We may even have, I don't know if we know, we probably have more tools than tools that make tools, but we have quite a few tools that make tools. Some extremely sophisticated, as in the technology of medicine, right? All right, so now even nano tools, we're talking microscopic. So that's one. Another characteristic is the fire, harnessing fire. Why harnessing fire? Because fire was used not only for cooking, but also for lighting the cave at night. Of course, they all got intoxicated with CO2 or carbon monoxide, but they could use it for lighting. They can warm up, and also defense, because at night in an open prairie, you build a fire and the carnivores, the top carnivores, stay away. Animals instinctively stay away from fire. Okay, so it can be used also as defense. So harnessing fire was a big thing. For example, in this cave in South Africa, about 1 million years ago, some charred remains, right? When they analyzed these pieces of charcoal, they noticed that the temperature range to form this kind of charcoal structure would have to be a campfire type of temperature range, not a wildfire type. There's a temperature range difference between a campfire and a wildfire. Okay, and so the experts on carbon and carbon shards, carbon charcoal, can tell the difference in the structure of that charcoal. So that's how they can tell that this is a campfire charcoal and not a wildfire charcoal. In other words, a fire that was made by humans. Yeah, so a campfire is made by humans. A wildfire is made by nature. Nature, yeah, just a lightning, right? So this is harnessing. When you have a campfire, this is, I don't know if it's direct or indirect evidence, but it's evidence that humans had harnessed fire then, right? So about 1 million years ago. So cultural traits. This is with regards to behavior, because we're dealing here at the 4 levels, really, right? We got anatomically, physiologically, molecular, and behavioral. So at the behavioral level, we find that is unique to the human: art, burying the dead, clothing, and religion. Why? Because we're trying to determine phylogenetically, not only when we started as sapiens, but did our other extinct homos, did the other extinct homos have or not have a soul? We can only get at it indirectly, right? But if they had some of these traits, maybe they did. Because another way of saying a soul is a conscience. And a conscience could be an aesthetic conscience, could be an ethical conscience, can be an intellectual conscience, can be a social conscience. So you see, we have different types of behaviors, all emanating from conscience, which from the Latin, cum scientia, is with knowledge. So using knowledge to determine our behavior, to elicit behavior. Okay, follow the argument. So if we find traces of some of this, for example, in Neanderthal, perhaps we can posit a conscience on Neanderthal. We can certainly posit that these characteristics, even on the most primitive sapiens that have been found. They have some degree of all these. For example, burying the dead, which is very much related to, we have to ask, why would one bury a dead? As opposed to walking away from the carcass, cadaver, as other animals do. Yes, I know that the elephant sticks around, and I know the elephant mom sticks around the dead baby, and the mother dolphin continues to bring up the dead baby dolphin to the surface because they have to learn how to breathe from the surface. Even the dead, until she becomes exhausted, at some point she abandons the dead baby, all right? But they don't literally bury them. We do. So how to interpret? Could we infer burying the dead is some longing or some hint of an afterlife? That there's something beyond, there's something metaphysical beyond the physical. Now, it's not just burying the dead. It happens that when these dead are buried, we find on these cadavers clothing. We find on these cadavers food jars. Could that be a hint of an afterlife? That when they wake up after the death, they may be hungry? Why bury a mother and her child together? Okay. So the oldest burial to date is in Israel, in this cave, Kozef cave, in to about 100,000 years ago. Fine. But there is actually a cave in France of a Neanderthal, a burial site of a Neanderthal, 50,000 years ago. And this is Neanderthal. Exciting, huh? So maybe they did have a soul. Speculative, we'll never, I guess we'll know eventually. That's the actual cave. La Chapelle is a region in France where they found a lot of fossils, a lot of, including Neanderthals and sapiens, all right? Could be, yeah, that's interesting. Yes, by sapiens. They feel guilty after wiping them out, right? Well, we're going to kill you, but we're going to give you a burial just in case you wake up afterwards. Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's all speculative, but it's there. It's there. All right. So now we have the dispersal, right? So there's no question that the genus came out of Africa, and that we as sapiens and Neanderthal came out of Africa anywhere between 1 million and 200,000 years ago. Now, what is controversial is the dispersal routes and also how many times did we come out of Africa. So once or multi migrations. Okay, that's what's still controversial. This is again from Barton, diagram that he has. First, note before the green migration route, note that this diagram represents more or less what the continents would have looked like back then. So the contour, the coastline, the blue coastline is the ancient, and the brown coastline is the current. So this is Singapore. This is the region of Southeast Asia, right? This is Vietnam, I believe. Okay, so the brown contour is the contemporary, is the current coastline. But the blue, it goes back to about 2 million years ago. Oh no, I'm sorry, 65,000 years ago, my bad. So in other words, this was a tropicalized Earth when there was more take it back. Let me think this for a moment. Think if there's more land mass, this was a winterization. This was winterization. In other words, the surface of the ocean was lower than today, meaning that there were more ice caps. This is probably, yeah, one of the last, not the last ice age. So the last ice age, last day. Okay, so this represents kind of the height of the last ice age, because the last ice age receded, at least in the North American continent, 10 to 12,000 years ago. All right. That's when we had the migration of plants and animals into Florida and southern US, 10 to 12,000 years ago, including perhaps primitive humans. So yeah, so this represents the last ice age, maybe at the height of it, cold, right? And these are the routes. So it seems that from the fossil record, we tend to stick toward the coastal, bordering the coastal line, coming out of Africa, out of equatorial Africa, around the region of the Great Rift Valley, where the Leakeys were doing all the research. I remember they were famous, I think in the 70s, the 80s, they were Richard Leakey and those. They were discovering all the fossils. What is still Leakey? Yeah. Okay, when he was young, Richard Leakey was discovering a number of fossils in Africa and equatorial Africa. And the Great Rift Valley was very famous back then. There's young Leakey with reconstruction of one of his finds, Great Rift Valley. And the whole Leakey family then devoted into this, at least the children, I don't know if the grandchildren also, but they got into it. This is the Great Rift Valley over at the Horn of Africa and Lake Turkana, Lake Victoria. Is considered more or less the origin of humans here. Here's a more informative map. Okay, well, you can look it up later here, maybe, yeah. Places where fossils have been found, human fossils. So the migration was generally going south around Cape Town there, South Africa, and then north. Coastal migration, which is where the low-hanging fruit would be, staying close to the equator. Remember, this is a winterized Earth, so going inland was getting cold, and they kind of skirted the coastline where it was warmest in general. So this is the controversy, single migration out, single or multi. Going forward a little bit. This gives some dates of migration routes. Here we have, so this is Lake Victoria, for example, the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, the Great Rift Valley here. Going north. And here is one split into Europe or Asia. And then here's another split and intermingling, admixtures and intermingling of Neanderthals, essentially in the Middle East, whereas this one would be in Southeast Asia with the Denisovians. And much later, as our ancestors traversed all of Asia, either by land or by coast, through the Bering Straits into North America. From North America, basically two corridors. One corridor went horizontal, and the other corridor went vertical, south. Even, I would say, this is not too well represented. In my opinion, this line should be a little closer to the coastline, because what do we have here? First, we have the Alaskan Rockies, right? Then it comes down to the American Rockies. But there's land in between the Rockies and the coast, the Pacific coast. So that's a corridor. The Rockies, of course, the 12,000, 14,000 peaks, that's very inhospitable, very harsh, cold weather, very windy also, and storms. And so staying along the coast, going south, the Rockies eventually become, in Mexico, what is today Mexico, becomes the Sierra Madre Occidental. So they have their own cordillera, their own mountain range on the west coast, near the west coast, which is what today Mexico. Then we get into Central America, which was actually created when the two plates collided, the northern and the southern plate. North American and Southern American plate migrated towards each other, generated what is today known as Central America, which split the Atlantic from the Pacific. But back then, there was a corridor here, an oceanic corridor, eventually to South America. And again, here, this arrow is very, very general. It should actually stay along the coast, because the equivalent of our Rockies is the Southern Andes, right? The Cordillera de los Andes, the Andes mountain range, which again hugs the coast, more or less. So they would have stayed along the, between the mountain range and the coastline. And then horizontal migrations from there, inland, much more recent. But basically all within the past 50 to 60,000 years, which is very, very recent in historical time, not historical, but in geologic time. All right, finally, I just want to leave you with a thought, which is we even have some kind of evidence, lateral, for the reference. And this is going to be a segue into the following lectures, which are going to be more biblical, theological, religious, spiritual, all right? In other words, overall metaphysical, but trying to integrate with the physical reality, the physical fact. I mean, many avenues point to our having evolved from ancestors. our species having evolved from ancestors. Okay? Now, so for homework, just look it up. Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. Again, we're in the age of equal opportunity and non-discrimination between the sexes, right? So this is what we have. It turns out that our mitochondria are organelles inside the cell, and these are like the FPL. These are the chargers. These are the chemical chargers of the cell where they recharge the energy molecules. The ATPs, the adenosine triphosphate, is the energy molecule of our cells that allows for metabolism. In other words, metabolism are chemical reactions that occur in an orderly fashion. And because they occur in an orderly fashion, they need extra energy to be done, basically activation energy and so forth. For example, enzymes that speed up the reaction. Well, where does that energy come from? That energy comes from a molecule that is like a little tiny battery, a microscopic battery that provides energy for these reactions to occur. That battery has to be recharged periodically. And that battery is recharged in the mitochondria, right? So the mitochondria are like the rechargers of this chemical called adenosine triphosphate. We'll look at it in more detail in next course. But basically the mitochondria are little tiny organelles inside each one of our cells that allows for metabolism to happen because they supply the energy. They're the energy source. And we have several thousand mitochondria in each one of our cells in the body. Now, let's go back to when we were zygotes, right? When we were zygote, we were a single cell. Let's go one moment before the zygote. What do we have? Our mother's egg and our father's sperm fertilizing, okay? Now the nucleus is two pronuclei. There's the nucleus of the sperm and the nucleus of the egg that are gonna fuse in the process of fertilization. But the cytoplasm, the non-nucleus part of the cell that makes a zygote, comes mostly from where? The sperm or the egg? The cytoplasm of the zygote, our first individual cell, comes mostly from the mother, from the egg, not from the sperm. The sperm has very little cytoplasm, right? Because it's mostly just a package of DNA, of nuclear material. So our cytoplasm at the zygote level came mostly from the fertilized egg that was our mother's contribution. So the vast majority of our mitochondria come from our mother. Not only that, mitochondria also has DNA. It's known as mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA. And so that mtDNA, which goes mostly for making the mitochondria, is maternally inherited. You see? So mitochondria are maternally inherited because they come from the egg. So we can trace by doing DNA analysis on our mitochondria and on the mitochondria of our mothers and on the mitochondria of our maternal grandmother. And you follow that matrilineal line back, okay? We can trace the DNA and we can do a phylogenetics of our mitochondrial DNA, which is different from the nuclear DNA. And so we can trace our maternal lineage back to a single female who is known as mitochondrial Eve, borrowing the word from the Bible, a single mom, human mom, Homo sapiens. All right? Now, because we are in the land of opportunity and equal rights and all that, men, we're not gonna get left behind because our mitochondria comes from our mom. And our sister's mitochondria also comes from our mom. But our maleness comes from our dad. And our sisters don't have maleness because their chromosomes are XX, but our chromosomes are XY. So we can trace our Y chromosome through our dads, because when our dads produced the sperm that eventually fertilized the egg of our mom that made us, 50% of that sperm was X sperm, and the other 50% was Y sperm on average. It's a statistical average, all right? Now keep in mind there are millions or hundreds of millions of sperm in each ejaculate, but only one fertilizes the egg. So it's a 50-50 chance if it's an X sperm that fertilizes or if it's a Y sperm. And that's what determines the sex, right? So it happened that for the men, it was a Y sperm that fertilized our mother's egg. For our sisters, it was an X sperm that fertilized that egg. Straightforward. So we can trace our patrilineal heritage, bless you, only on men. Only on men, because only men normally have Y chromosome. So we can trace the men's linear, patrilineal, through our fathers and their fathers and their fathers, 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 fathers. And we come up to Y chromosome Adam. Now the trick is, which would make a single man back anywhere between 200,000 or 2 million years ago. So now the trick is for these two people to have met and to have mated and to have fertile offspring. And from those fertile offspring, the rest is history, literally history, human history. Okay, so look it up, Y chromosome, Adam and mitochondrial Eve. And we can talk some more about it coming up. They're not exactly biblical Adam and Eve, but it's analogous. It's a reference. The first human, Homo sapiens, biologically, and the first Homo sapiens, biblical.
In this case, the chicken came before the egg.
Yes, exactly. The mating had to be before the offspring. Absolutely. Yeah. So, you know, and that's why OBGYNs, I guess, and embryologists, they see the adult as a potential embryo, right? Because it's all about the embryo for them.
Father Shofi.
Yes, Christina.
So I know we're not going to talk about it today, but the only question that of course, I'm going to find out a little bit more of what you just said, but the story in the Bible says that the mitochondria came from the chromosome Adam, because that's what it says, right? It was taken
from the Bible.
Man. Well, it was taken from the man, so he created a woman.
Oh, the rape, but not the mitochondria.
Oh, no.
So the Bible doesn't mention mitochondria.
No. I'm just using the language that you're saying, mitochondrial Eve and chromosome Y.
Yes.
And so anyway, it's just a question there now.
Right.
Something there.
Okay, so this is just, your question is an opening to the next couple of lectures, but basically we're going to see Genesis 1, chapter 1, and Genesis chapter 2, the rape occurs in chapter 2, right? As two separate versions of the same creation story. So two separate narratives of the same creation story, looked at from two different angles, okay? So hold on to your question, very valid, but I need to get into the next two lectures to kind of give an answer. I'm just saying that biologically, we talk about mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. And why have we now all of a sudden taking up biblical terms to describe something that's biological? Because of the compatibility between the physical and the metaphysical, far from being opposite to each other. Okay, so stay tuned, more to come. That's the last slide there. So, all right, look it up a little, read up a little bit, it'll prep you up for the next couple of lectures coming up. Okay, any other questions, comments? We're good? Yep.
Stop recording and then I will ask my questions.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. So stay tuned. We'll see you next Saturday for the next lecture. You might want to also for the next Saturday, if you want to just review for example, the table of contents of the Bible, just a table of contents, Old Testament, New Testament, and that starts prepping us up. All right, thanks again. All the best.